Hello everyone, my name is Firoze. I'm a second year PhD student at the University of Guelph. In this presentation, I'll cover how political economy can be used to understand agricultural misinformation better and how we can empower agricultural extension advisory services to combat online agricultural misinformation. Now, one thing we have to be very clear at the get-go is that the integrity of the information and the authenticity of the information is the key component of agricultural extension advisory services. Unfortunately, we see the unprecedented rise of online misinformation, and what is also happening that agricultural extension services are rapidly getting privatized, which endangers the authenticity of information that is provided by agricultural extension services. Now, first of all, we need to understand what exactly is misinformation because there's a lot of confusion, misunderstanding. I'll try to simplify the definition as simple as possible. So, misinformation, or sometimes it is known as fake news, it is not a straightforward term. So, I'm going to give you three different ideas: misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Misinformation happens when we share a false information, not essentially knowing it is false. I mean, the information is false, but we don't have any specific intention to harm anybody. That's misinformation. But disinformation, on the other hand, is a deliberately shared false information. It is by design deceptive. That's disinformation. So misinformation and disinformation is easily understandable, but what is harder actually to combat is malinformation, when true information is taken out of the context to spread confusion, to sow doubt in mind. That is called malinformation. After the unprecedented growth of information in 2016 US election, we have seen that malinformation has been mostly successful in spreading misinformation. In this presentation, when I say misinformation, I'm covering all of this information together and I'm using it as an umbrella term. Now, what's the knowledge gap and research significance of studying online agricultural misinformation? Is that we are now currently living in an informational civilization. In the history of humanity, we have never lived in a time when the civilization was informational. That is what we're going through right now. And we are going through digital capitalism, which is dependent on data. Now, what we have also noticed that the pandemic has increased our dependency on digital means that we are more susceptible to misinformation. And most importantly, that agriculture is at crossroads. We are facing multiple existential threats. The world is dealing with devastating emergency of climate change. Now, what is the implication of studying agricultural misinformation? Is that nearly 26.5% global population are employed in agriculture sector, and by 2050 we will have to feed nearly 10 billion people. Unfortunately, we have also seen the growing rise in politicization of science. We know the recent events, how there have been protests against vaccine mandates, primarily in Canada and also many other countries in the world, where we have seen that the science can very quickly be politicized, causing socioeconomic instability. What's very difficult for a lot of us to understand that nearly everyone is susceptible to misinformation. I'm sure that you know people who are progressive, who will probably make fun of those who don't believe in climate change. But at the same time, a lot of those people will be anti-GMO, not essentially knowing GMO. In this presentation, I'm not trying to take any side. I'm just trying to explain that how, despite our political ideologies, we all are susceptible to misinformation. Now, we need to understand one thing very clearly, that digital capitalism is very different from conventional capitalism. Digital capitalism is data dependent. Digital capitalism depends on datafying our life. Because it is data dependent, digital capitalism will find different ways, and it has been finding different ways to datafy our life. Pretty much every aspect of our life are now getting digitalized, whether you are working online or you have a social media, you are producing something. All your digital footprint is the datafication of life. And it is also giving rise of data relations. In historical capitalism, we had the owners of the means of production, the owners of factories and companies, and we had the laborers. in the digital capitalism, the data relations divide us into two groups. One is the group who are producing data, whose life is actually datafied, producing all this data. And the other group is the tech titans who are appropriating this data for producing profit. Human attention is an extremely profitable commodity. We often fail to understand behind the rhetorics of technical progress that why the tech titans want to connect the unconnected. Now, let's try to understand that how digital capitalism is different from the historical capitalism. The historical capitalism, for its growth, needed to colonize other lands, colonized human bodies, and brought them as slaves. And in order to do that, they needed to use the ideology of civilizing mission. So historical capitalism's trinity was colonialism, was the ideology of civilizing mission, and the extraction of natural resources for supporting the growth. But under digital capitalism, what they are doing is that it's a new trinity of colonizing virtual spaces, colonizing human attention, and using the discourses of technical progress for justifying the process of connecting the unconnected. But in the process, we fail to understand that digital capitalism needs to connect everybody for extracting our attention. Our attention is now the commodity. We all know that Marx famously called religion is the opium of the mass. But what we don't often understand, Marx said that religion is actually the coping mechanism. Under digital capitalism, distraction is the coping mechanism. Marx, critiquing Hegel, has written is that religious suffering is the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. And this is where Marx is absolutely right, is that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature and the heart of the heartless world and the soul of the soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Now, what Marx is saying here is that under capitalist brutal system, people hold on to religion as a coping mechanism. But under digital capitalism, social media has emerged as the digital opium. We are hooked to all the social media platforms. Our behavioral addiction is rooted because we cannot deal with capitalist cruel system, and we use distraction as a survival mechanism. Now, from here, we are clearly understanding is that maximizing user engagement is absolutely necessary condition for ensuring the capitalist growth under digital capitalism. So this is why behavioral addiction is very important in digital capitalism, where surveillance, what we do on social media, what we do in digital spaces, is actually part of the business model under digital capitalism. Now, in this slide, I'll explain computational racial capitalism. Historical capitalism needed to create two classes, the have and the have-nots, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Historical capitalism did it by creating hierarchy, which many sociologists call a racialization. One group exploited the other group. Now, that was called racial capitalism by Cedric Robinson. Now, here, computational racial capitalism means that the digital spaces has divided all the users in digital spaces into two groups. One group is the digital proletariat, the other group is digital bourgeoisie. The tech titans are the digital bourgeoisie because they extract our data. And now this is important, that this is how computational racial capitalism is extracting all our data for extraction. Misinformation and disinformation weaponizes our emotion to maximize user engagement. The recent Freedom Convoy in Canada to cancel the vaccine mandate is probably one of the best examples. In this picture, you can see that the protesters standing against Canada's parliament in Ottawa are raising a sign saying "Assassin Trudeau." Imagine if this sign was held up by somebody black or indigenous or people of color, what could have possibly happened? From this, what I'm trying to explain, that we see the declining trust in governments and science, and we see clearly ideology working behind this kind of protest, it shows that who has the right to protest. I can say with confidence that in Black Lives Matter and or indigenous rights movement, the protest would be very different. Now from here, what we need to understand, it's very easy to judge these protesters, but what we often fail to see that the growing inequality in the society is weaponizing our emotion, which is creating a fertile ground for misinformation. Again, studying agriculture misinformation is nothing new. Cornell Alliance for Science has been studying agriculture misinformation for nearly a decade. Now, this is some of the key lessons that Cornell Alliance for Science have learned combating agriculture misinformation in Africa. Get there first. Once agriculture misinformation spreads in a community, it's very hard to combat. Second, messenger matters. We know there are reasons for countries to distrust Western science and Western institutions for cruel history of colonialism and capitalist exploitation. This is why, to combat agriculture misinformation, it is extremely important that we bring in diverse voice so that the messenger can express the concerns effectively and the community members actually listen to the messenger. Picture is more effective in spreading disinformation. Therefore, picture needs to be used for combating disinformation. And knowledge translation. Scientists are notorious for expressing things in complex language. Knowledge translation is necessary. We need to speak in general people's language. Friedrich Nietzsche gives us a very important insight to misinformation. Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. Once we believe something, we don't examine it, and that becomes our conviction. Therefore, we need to understand people who are spreading agriculture misinformation. Where are they actually spreading from? And we also need to recognize the agriculture misinformation is also getting supported by other sectors of misinformation, notably the health misinformation. Let's not forget, when a scientist from MIT actually jumps on the bandwagon of misinformation, it becomes very difficult to combat misinformation. Also, agriculture misinformation and health misinformation, they have some commonalities. Both of them come from some of the common source of distrust. Both of them are connected to Bill Gates, big corporations, and that makes combating agriculture misinformation very difficult. And agriculture misinformation, like health misinformation, has potential to create socioeconomic instability. This might sound unlikely, but if we look at the history, we'll find evidences. Mary Mason, an eco-arsonist, was sentenced to prison for 22 years because of vandalism in the Michigan State University. And famous eco-feminists like Vandana Shiva supported the actions of Mary Mason. So who are the stakeholders for this research? Agriculture extension and advisory services, both private and public, are directly impacted by agricultural misinformation. Government and policymakers, and also public institutions and researchers, the producers of scientific knowledge, are also impacted by agricultural misinformation. Now, if I want you to take some key takeaways from this presentation, they're with this. Agricultural extension and advisory services are directly impacted by agricultural misinformation. Number two, science denial is linked to declining public trust at a time of multiple existential crises, and agricultural misinformation is part of science denialism. Number three, increased connectivity, as we are getting connected to the digital infrastructure, increases our susceptibility to misinformation. Fourth, and the last one, that political economy provides us a better theoretical framework to study, understand, and build policies to combat agricultural misinformation. Thank you for your attention.